as I make these final clicks, check my buttons, and it looks like I'm ready to go with Chapter 18, the Endocrine System. Did you actually ever think we would get here? First message for the endocrine system. It is a global control system. It has effects all over the body. Some endocrine responses are hormones that act locally just on surrounding cells, but many of them are released into the circulatory system, into the blood, and they affect target tissues all over the body. It is the chemical regulation system. Here's the terminology you need to talk about the endocrine system. Number one, the organs are called glands. Their purpose of these glands is to secrete a chemical messenger. That chemical messenger is called a hormone. And that chemical messenger will activate a specific receptor. Wherever you have a receptor, the signal is delivered, and that makes that area a target tissue. Now, we're going to recognize a kind of a division here. This chapter talks about the major glands of the body. We recognize them as separate lumps of tissue, and we name them a specific gland of the endocrine system. Now, I want to basically put an asterisk by that definition. That's for Chapter 18. There are other cells that are clumps of glandular cells that produce a secretion that has a hormonal effect. But because they're distributed through the walls of another named organ, they're glandular tissues rather than organs that are named glands. Both have endocrine effects. Both affect through chemical messengers called hormones, and all of them are going to affect a specific target tissue because of the receptor that's there. Now, we regulate the basics of our metabolism with hormonal effects. Look at these titles: energy utilization, ion concentrations, and water balance. That's the overall osmotic pressure. That's the overall transmembrane potential that's being regulated by hormonal balance. Blood sugar, the only carbohydrate that our body actively regulates, trying to raise and lower the concentration based on its circulating concentration in the blood. Reproductive function is something that's regulated by hormones, and these three dots kind of indicate that this is a very incomplete list. We can talk about regulation on a cell or a small group of cells, on a tissue within an organ, on an entire organ's activities, turning it off and on, or even coordinated, a multi-organ response that has a whole body effect. In a way, sympathetic stimulation was a part of the nervous system. Because of its activation of the adrenal gland, endocrine gland, it produces coordinated effects in muscle, heart, lungs, eyes, all at the same time from a single release. We're going to see three chemical types. There are some that are simply made from an amino acid, some that are made because they are a string of peptides. Now, these go from very small. There are some peptide hormones that only have 7 amino acids. So compared to most proteins, they're kind of a fragment. And they go to very, very large hormones. We also have lipid derivatives because we basically have two, amino acid and peptides are kind of related and very hydrophilic. Lipid derivatives, very hydrophobic. Because of that, we have different issues of solubility, of delivery, and of activation. Receptors, plus the chemical messengers, are what enable the signal to be delivered and that target tissue to notice and make a change in its metabolism. So let's go on and look at these basic properties. I want to make some basic distinctions here, because when we talk about communication, messages being sent between cells, there are 4 basic types shown here. Now, down at the bottom, synaptic communication is a type of chemical communication based on neurotransmitters. That's the mechanism for the nervous system. It's an electrochemical. The speed comes from the electricity moving, the electrical signal moving through these very long cells. So that's very quick. But there's that gap, the synapse, and it's the neurotransmitter that basically allows the passage of that electrical impulse from this cell down to this one. So we've already covered the bottom row. There are three kinds of chemical communication that are basically divided on the extent of their effect. Up here, direct communication. See this? This is from cell to cell, and it depends on a specific connection. Gap junctions. Gap junctions allow ions, small solutes, soluble materials act as chemical mediators. Basically, it's limited to a group of cells that are connected by those gap junctions, which are usually very low, very small. Paracrine communication, you can see the hormone being loaded into vesicles. That's those yellow dots, and by exocytosis expelling them, but they're just diffusing through these intracellular spaces. So they're still diffusing, and they have a local effect. We call these paracrine factors, and they basically can excite cells in the immediate area. Finally, and the emphasis of this chapter is endocrine communication, where vesicles package the hormones and they release them in such a way that hormones are in the bloodstream and circulated all over the body. Wherever there is a receptor cell, there is a target tissue. This is how we activate the whole body in sympathetic stimulation from the release of norepinephrine from the adrenal gland. I want you to look carefully at this figure because it gives you a great summary. If you know the names of the glands and their hormones from this chapter, from this figure, you're going to be well on your way to understanding the endocrine system. Now, the purple boxes are the ones we're mainly going to review, but I want to wave at this right-hand column, which says organs with secondary endocrine function. That means we're going to name the organ by a name related to its system. The heart is definitely a part of the cardiovascular system. We're going to begin our study next semester, the cardiovascular system. But the heart does release natriuretic peptides, which have hormonal effects. Atrial and brain are the names ANP and BNP, even though they're both produced in the heart. And they will have effects on things like blood volume. The thymus, which is a gland of the immune system, the so-called lymphatic system, releases thymosins, which are endocrine factors. Adipose tissue, leptin, is something that has a hormonal effects on digestion. The digestive tract does secrete a number of hormones that coordinate these system functions, things like glucose metabolism, affecting a behavioral trait, the perception of appetite, coordinating the activity of the piece of the digestive system where the food is passing through. Kidneys secrete EPO and calcitriol. EPO has to do with red blood cell production in the skeletal system, in the bone marrow. And calcitriol has an effect on calcium absorption. The gonads, our reproductive system's main job, of course, is to reproduce offspring, but the hormones that basically regulate those systems have profound effects on our development. Now, over here on the right-hand side, you can see the chapters that we will be reviewing in the second semester that contain these elements of function. For right now, if you just survey them and know them, that's okay. Our main emphasis in this chapter will be sorting out these boxes that have purple headings. And I want to emphasize that up at the top, we have a master gland, the pituitary gland, and a region of the brain. The hypothalamus is the base of the diencephalon. and extends into where it connects there at the midline. And it is the coordination between neural function in the brain and the release of hormones through the body. So this three-step process, hypothalamus to pituitary to another major gland, is going to be a relationship that we see frequently. For this first kind of survey, I'm only going to name them. The hypothalamus has multiple roles: producing hormones directly, controlling the pituitary, the master gland, and finally sending messages to the adrenal gland for norepinephrine and epinephrine release. The pituitary, as I said, is the master gland of the endocrine system, and it's divided by a different appearing tissue into a anterior and a posterior lobe. The posterior lobe is reserved for those hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior lobe. So they are, when called for, directly released from the posterior lobe. The anterior lobe consists of multiple clusters of cells of different kind that are producing different hormones that are going to, when released, control the specific major glands of the body. And so that's why we see the abbreviations RH or SH often between for the hormones of these of this anterior lobe. RH stands for releasing hormone. SH stands for stimulating hormone. And we're going to see that their release from the anterior pituitary is going to actually turn on the thyroid or turn on the adrenal gland or the pancreas. Let's take a look at our quick survey of those target glands. The thyroid gland, which sits here right below the larynx, produces two thyroid hormones, which are general overall activators. T3 and T4 is sufficient, but they're called thyroxine and triiodothyronine. And they basically are metabolism activators. They speed up our metabolism. Calcitonin is an additional hormone from the thyroid that affects calcium balance. The adrenal glands we've run into before, and we know that the medulla produces epinephrine and norepinephrine in sympathetic stimulation response. The cortex produces cortisol, corticosterone, aldosterone, and androgens. Look at that array. Androgens are sex hormones. Aldosterone affects water balance. Corticosterone and cortisol are general activation steroid hormones. The pancreas is a famous gland because in your medical practice years, diabetes will be a major condition that you have to contend with. And the primary hormones here are insulin and glucagon, which have opposite effects on blood sugar. I'll explain that in a moment. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't say that the pancreas also produces many other secretions. Because digestion is specific, you have to have specific enzymes that break down the food molecules, the polymers, into their monomeric form. Once they're monomers, the cells can digest them and make ATP. And many, many, many of those enzymes, dozens, come from the pancreas. The pineal gland is back up right here at the back of the diencephalon, kind of right under the edge of the corpus callosum, and it produces melatonin. Now we all think, because melatonin is now a non-prescription drug, we all think we understand what it does, and we take it to go to sleep, and we give it to our children to go to sleep. Its actual effect on the body is a little more complex, not just helping set up that sleep and alert or awake cycle, but also controlling kind of the expectation of the body of when we sleep and when we are awake. We're often counseled to have a regular time of to go to bed, a regular extended period of sleep, and then a regular time to get up in the morning. And that produces a kind of a thing called a circadian rhythm in the body. It's easy to go to sleep at your regular bedtime. Those of you who, like me, have done shift work in many different times and places know sometimes it's hard to change that expectation and change your sleep patterns. On the back of the thyroid is our last gland. It's interesting because it's on the tissue of the thyroid. There are 4 spots that are clearly different in their tissue appearance. I'll show you in a minute. They're located on the posterior surface of the thyroid. They represent the parathyroid, and what they produce is parathyroid hormone. So there's the lineup. There are the tissues and the organs that produce the hormones. We're going to spend some time today with those specific major glands of the endocrine system. First, let's look at these 3 categories. Here's the amino acid derivatives. Derivatives of tyrosine. Tyrosine is a pretty big amino acid. What you can see here is the amine group and the carboxylic acid group and the alpha hydrogen on this central carbon. It's right under where the pointer is. But look at that R group on tyrosine. It has a CH2 bonded to a 6-sided benzene ring with 2 iodines attached to a connecting oxygen to another 6-sided ring with 2 iodines attached. So modifying tyrosine gives you this big hormone called thyroxine, a T4 hormone. The catecholamines, epinephrine, are also made from tyrosine, and the sources include our diet. Meat, dairy, and fish all have quite a bit of tyrosine. Tryptophan is another good-sized amino acid, and it produces melatonin, the product of the pineal gland, which we use in circadian rhythms and sleep cycles. Now, over here, the peptide hormones, there are a whole bunch of them. Small and large, glycoproteins and short polypeptides to small proteins that have a variety of effects. And under here, things like thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone, again coming from the pituitary and affecting reproductive function, belong to the glycoproteins. What does that mean? Glyco means sugar, right? So it's a protein with a sugar group attached. The pure polypeptides, small or larger, produce things like oxytocin, growth hormones, and are released from those are released from the pituitary gland as well. Now we get over to the lipids, and we basically are making a chemical leap. Over here we have hydrophilic hormones, work well in water. Over here we have lipid derivatives, the eicosanoids and the steroid hormones. Heard that before? Steroid hormones. Basically, hormones, these lipid derivatives go right through the membrane, so there's no problem with getting them in and out of cells. The eicosanoids are important paracrine factors, which we mentioned for that vesicle exocytosis mechanism. It's not going to be a major part of what we do in this chapter. But the prostaglandins are involved in coordinating cellular activities, and especially on a local basis, since their primary release is in the intracellular fluid. Down here, steroid hormones get a lot of attention because they not only affect our sexual function and the differentiation of our bodies into 2 genders, but they also enhance other hormones like growth hormones and thyroid hormones to produce more growth, to produce more strength, to produce more coordination. And so as a kind of a booster of athletic performance, steroids work fine. In fact, they work so fine that they've been declared illegal in most applications. Hormone action is specific to the receptor. So if the receptor is on the plasma membrane, it can affect that cell. Some hormones act inside the cell to receptors that are in the cytoplasm. Often this involves a chain and not a simple receptor to direct action. You'll have a first messenger, the hormone, and it may activate another messenger, an intermediate. We saw this before in the nervous system when we saw that the main neurotransmitter was acting on a G protein. And once the G protein was activated, we got the production of what? Cyclic AMP. So there was a chain of reactions before the actual effect was produced. The same can occur in the hormones of the endocrine system. Our most important secondary messengers are going to be familiar. Cyclic AMP, which we mentioned before with the nervous system and G proteins, but also another cyclic GMP. Do you remember how in the, well, we haven't covered that yet, in the Krebs cycle, we have the production of ATP. We also produce some GTP. Well, this is the monophosphate form of that. It indicates low body energy, chemical energy. Calcium ion, Ca+2, is also an important second messenger. What does that mean? It means that if calcium ion is not present, you can't get the hormonal effects. We see here a couple of G proteins and hormone activity drawings. The hormone to the receptor, G protein goes active. Now, effects on cyclic AMP, you see this activated G protein makes cyclic AMP directly. When cyclic AMP goes up in the cell, it opens ion channels and activates enzymes. Examples are things like epinephrine and norepinephrine on what are called beta receptors, calcitonin, parathyroid hormone, etc. All use this mechanism. Epinephrine and norepinephrine also have other receptors, and adenylate cyclase produces this cyclic AMP. Another enzyme will convert cyclic AMP to AMP. If it's not cyclic, then that reduces enzyme activity and counters that energy production. Over here, its effect, G protein effects on calcium levels, open those gates, get calcium into the cell. Calcium acts as a secondary messenger because calcium has to be present here binding calmodulin in order to activate enzymes. Now, these are the alpha-1 receptors for the epinephrine-norepinephrine system. When we talked about sympathetic stimulation, we just said epinephrine and norepinephrine, but look how many different hormones are involved to finally regulate that response. Oxytocin is also activated in this way. Regulatory hormones of the hypothalamus, the stimulating and releasing hormones, and several of the eicosanoids basically depend on calcium. So here we are back to calcium. Calcium's soluble content in the body is very low. We have a lot of calcium, but most of it is the solid calcium in our bones. But look at this. I've said before, you can't contract a muscle. You can't clot blood. You can't send a nerve impulse without calcium. Well, here are a number of other systems. Oxytocin is the hormone from the hypothalamus stored in the posterior pituitary that's released in order to induce labor contractions. And also oxytocin's secondary effect is to let down milk, not produce milk. Prolactin does that. But to make milk let down so that the breast actually allows the milk to flow to the nipple. Regulatory hormones of the hypothalamus, very, very important and depending on calcium. So thyroid releasing hormone, we release it, it goes to the thyroid. If calcium isn't there in proper levels, it works. Intracellular hormone binding shows this. This is showing the movement of a hormone, in this case a 4-ring, probably a cholesterol derivative, into the cytoplasm where it binds a receptor and activates any number of things. This left drawing is showing a penetration of this complex into the nucleus where it picks out a specific hormone receptor complex of the DNA and activates mRNA production and protein synthesis. So that protein synthesis is going to be specific to this target cell and is going to alter structural activity. In this case, a disaccharide is shown transporting in and binding a receptor and binding to the mitochondrion, or binding specifically, being transported specifically into the nucleus. And look at that connection, the same pathway. Once you activate a specific gene in the nucleus, you're going to make a specific protein. And when you bind the mitochondria, you're going to increase ATP production. So you're altering the level of cellular activity, with one of the effects being the production of that target protein. Endocrine activity is controlled by what are called endocrine reflexes. It is the location of that receptor that is going to determine the site of activity. And we call them reflexes because you don't have to send a lot of messages back and forth. You don't send messages back to the pituitary or back to the hypothalamus. Even though they start the cascade, you take care of it on the spot. The stimuli can change the extracellular fluids around the cells, which is called humoral. It can affect a receptor that's a specific hormone called hormonal, or a neurotransmitter, which is called neural. We've seen examples of all of these. Most often they're controlled by negative feedback, which means whatever the stimulus is, let's say that the stimulus is blood sugar increase toward the maximum limit of the range. The response, the release of insulin, is going to be to transport that circulating glucose into cells that will break it down to ATP. And that's all over the body, but insulin's effect is also to encourage and catalyze the polymerization of glucose to glycogen in the liver. So this high level is brought down. So let's start at the very top, the hypothalamus, not the top of the diencephalon, but the top of the endocrine system. We're going to see three ways that the hypothalamus acts in endocrine function. First, I've mentioned all of these. Hypothalamus here, we see the direct production by glandular cells of ADH and oxytocin and their transport down into this posterior lobe of the pituitary, where it is stored for later release. The second mode of action is a signal from the brain and from the hypothalamus to the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and that signal is specific to the pituitary hormone that will be released. And there are some, under a dozen, but there are certainly some major hormones where the target is a major gland. The third type of action from the hypothalamus region is this connection that we saw in the sympathetic nervous system, sending out through a collateral chain ganglion and a collateral ganglion all the way to the adrenal gland on the top of the kidney, where hormone, epinephrine, and norepinephrine are released. So three types of action from the hypothalamus. And we're ready to move to the master gland, located directly below. This stalk is called the infundibulum, and it holds a little kind of berry-shaped lobed gland called the pituitary. Now, normally if you take the brain out, if you've done it carefully, you'll see the pituitary hanging there, kind of right at the optic chiasma. You know that place where the optic nerves from the left eye and right eye cross over, form that X. Right behind that is this stalk and this pituitary lobe. Now, it's shown in this drawing in its natural protection, the cavity that we called the sella turcica in the sphenoid bone. The reason for that kind of rounded cavity with an opening at the top is to allow the pituitary gland to be well protected and supported. We see here the pars intermedia, very different tissue. You see it over here? See that? And by the way, although we haven't named it, that secretes melanocyte stimulating hormone. It releases a hormone of its own, but it divides this clearly different appearance. Notice the appearance of this anterior pituitary, and these have different lobes of operative cells making very different hormones. Over here in the posterior lobe, we have storage cavities for ADH and for oxytocin. So the pituitary, remember, master gland, because it's receiving lots of input from the hypothalamus. It is essentially controlled by it, but its impact of hormone release is going to activate whole major glands in the endocrine system. Because of that, we see an exception here that was mentioned earlier, but we got to mention it again. Most capillaries of the body, the capillaries are the blood vessels that are permeable. That's where oxygen is released and nutrients are released to surrounding cells. That's where wastes are picked up, including carbon dioxide, and transported away. Behind the blood-brain barrier created by the meninges, cells that are neuroglial cells regulate the exchange inside that barrier. Well, this is inside that barrier. The meninges wrap this whole system, but here we have a bit of a conflict, because if you are storing ADH or if you are storing oxytocin and there's a signal, release oxytocin, you dump it, you actually want that picked up and transported out as quickly as possible. So this is a place where we have naked capillaries, not just regular continuous capillaries, but capillaries that have holes, perforations in their membranes. So the uptake and transport is very rapid. The same thing applies over here to the reticular or net-like network of capillaries in the anterior pituitary. These are basically capillaries that are rigged for very rapid absorption and direct transport out of the pituitary gland and into the blood flow of the body. As a result, they form here's the blood flow in, superior hypophyseal artery, and the inferior hypophyseal artery are providing lots of blood flow. And then these capillaries are picking up the hormones when released and flowing out through the hypophyseal veins. Let's take a look at a couple of examples and try to illustrate in a general way the sequence of event. We're going to start over here on the left. Hypothalamus sends a releasing hormone to the pituitary anterior lobe. That releases hormone 1 into the bloodstream. The circulating blood delivers that hormone to an endocrine organ, such as the pancreas or the thyroid or the adrenal gland. It produces hormone 2, which then acts on the target tissue. That sequence is illustrated here with TRH, the thyroid releasing hormone, that causes thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary to activate the thyroid gland, which releases T3 and T4. Over here, we're going to the adrenal cortex. Is going to be what releases the glucocorticoids. So how do we start that? The hypothalamus. The releasing hormone is called corticotrophic releasing hormone. The pituitary hormone is called adrenocorticotrophic hormone. The effect on the adrenal cortex causes it to release the glucocorticoids that will activate the target tissue. Down here, we have a more complex one affecting our sexual differentiation. The hypothalamus is the producer of gonadotropic releasing hormone, which causes follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone to be released from the pituitary. Now, the relative concentrations of these and the timing of their release will target the different organs. In this case, we have listed the gonads in the different sexes. Testes and ovaries. Follicle-stimulating hormone involves inhibin in the testes and inhibin in estrogens in the ovaries. Luteinizing hormone produces progestins and estrogens in the ovaries, and testes release androgens in the male. So we're going to see other mechanisms. In this case, prolactin inhibiting hormone and prolactin releasing hormone are producing a regulating system that will initiate and continue the production of milk here in the mammary glands. But it is prolactin releasing hormone that will actually cause it to be released to the mammary glands. Think about this. Whereas most things like growth or thyroid levels are a constant thing, you really only produce prolactin when you're approaching late term pregnancy, and your body is sort of building up to that grand event of birth, and it's at that point you want the milk to be produced. As long as suckling is occurring, you want milk production to continue, and when suckling ceases with weaning, then you want that prolactin flow to stop. So we do see a number of complex control mechanisms, some for constant regulation, others for event-specific regulation. Well, a woman who has 4 children in her life is only going to be nursing in those 4 episodes. The rest of the time, the breasts don't produce milk. This diagram is a wonderful summary diagram, and we're going to go into some details in just a moment. But I want to present this diagram because so much of what will answer your questions and help you start to understand the endocrine system is controlled here. We start with the hypothalamus. See the 3 main modes of action. Here's the direct control to the adrenal gland, where the hypothalamic action on the adrenal medulla is actually only one of the responses of the sympathetic nervous system. Here we have adrenocorticotropic hormone acting on the cortex to produce and enhance these effects. This middle direct control of the hypothalamus over regulatory hormones in the anterior pituitary will lead to these other lines of regulation. So here we are going to the thyroid gland, growth hormone working on the liver, prolactin working on milk production, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone acting on the testes or on the ovaries. Look at the hormones that are produced by those overall regulating hormones. This whole central line coming down through FSH and LH really represents our sexual differentiation, controls the production of our appearances, our secondary sexual characteristics, regulates the activation of our gamete production. So in the males, making huge numbers of active sperm throughout their reproductive life. In the female, activating and regulating that unique cyclical maturation. Every 28 days, you're going to mature and release typically 1 egg. And you're basically going to not only release it, but you're going to delay its development to correspond to the arrival of sperm and enhance the potential for fertilization. Over here we have the direct release with oxytocin affecting reproductive organs, mostly the ductus deferens and prostate gland in the male, mostly the uterine smooth muscles and the mammary glands in the female. Over here we have an ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, working on the kidneys and on what concentration of urine you're making in order to regulate water release or water retention. So we have really quite a bit to cover. The most complex of these glands, of course, is the pituitary gland, with the pars distalis producing all of these hormones that are going to affect basically be released from the pituitary as a result of signals from these hormones from the hypothalamus, but are going to target these other glands to release these hormones. So we're going to discuss these one at a time. I just wanted to point out the table is a great summary. And this is just the anterior lobe. The pars intermedia, which is in normal adults is not very active. There's not much melanocyte-stimulating hormone produced in adults. And the melanin that's coloring your hair, coloring your skin, is something that is more active as in your growth phase. The posterior lobe we've already talked about. There is no hypothalamic regulatory hormone because the hypothalamus is producing these hormones. It's stored in the posterior pituitary gland. The ADH is going to target the kidneys. Oxytocin is going to target organs in the reproductive system. So let's start with an initial example on this first recorded section. The thyroid gland is located in the throat. It clasps the trachea and sits right below the larynx, the outer tube of this neck region. Here's the Adam's apple, the thyroid cartilage that is apparent in the front of the throat. Right below that hangs the thyroid gland. It looks like it encircles this area, but in fact it's C-shaped. It's open at the back, and we'll show you that in a minute. When you look inside, you see a definite organization of follicles, a surrounding set of epithelial cells enclosing a cavity. And off to the side, you see this thing labeled a C cell? Well, the follicles are going to produce one type of hormone, the C cells another. You can see the division here. Here's a thyroid follicle, and it's embedded in connective tissue and held in place. And over here, a single labeled C cell right at its margin. Let's take a look at the mechanism by which this works. This homeostasis mechanism on the right shows we're going to say that we decrease T3 and T4 concentrations in the blood, and it's detected. Low body temperature is also produced when thyroid hormones are low. So the hypothalamus detects thyroid releasing hormone is sent to the anterior pituitary. Thyroid stimulating hormone is released and goes through the blood to the thyroid gland where T3 and T4 are released. This causes an increase in body temperature and normal T3 and T4 effects on energy utilization. Over here we see some of the biochemistry involved, and a unique thing and a great illustration of what I'd call a micronutrient. We need iodine in our diet, tiny amounts. And if we do not get sufficient iodine, the reason that it produces health problems is because the hormones of the thyroid gland are iodohormones. You can see here the iodine arriving in the blood, being pumped into the follicle cell. This is a sensitive, but it's a pump. ADH is being used to move this in. It diffuses throughout the cell and moves here and binds to thyroid globulin, the precursor of the organic part of that hormone. Tyrosine joins with other amino acids in order to make a thyroid globulin here in the follicular cavity. This thyroid globulin is a complex being manufactured all at one time. We transport it back into the cell. By the way, this is an exocytosis, endocytosis, so more ATP is used. And a lysosome binds with it. The lysosome contains enzymes that will break the T4 and T3 pieces out release other amino acids, the T4 and T3 simply diffuse out into the capillaries. And when they reach, by circulation, reach their target tissue areas, diffuse into those regions and produce their effects. So thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, kind of present a number of very interesting stories. The overall effect is to raise the activity of cells. If you've ever known anyone who said they had a thyroid deficiency and talk to them about it, they will relate that they feel tired, they feel lassitude, they have no energy, no get up and go, and that's because of the depletion of their thyroid hormones. If you take iodine that's radioactive and inject it in a person and wait half an hour, then take a certain type of X-ray that identifies the location of that iodine, the throat area where the thyroid is lights up like a light bulb. All of the iodine you put in the bloodstream is sucked out right there because it is being used to make thyroid hormones. So what are the effects? Elevate oxygen consumption, which is a great and direct measure of ATP production and utilization. In children, it may cause an increase in temperature that's measurable. The heart rate, number of beats per minute, and the force of contraction, which we call the stroke volume. So it's not that it just gets faster, it actually is contracting harder. Blood pressure goes up. Sympathetic stimulation becomes easier to achieve. Sensitivity, the respiratory centers, oxygen and CO2 concentrations are enhanced. Red blood cell formation is stimulated, and over a period of hours to days, that means oxygen delivery is enhanced. Activity of other endocrine tissues are stimulated by increases in T3 and T4. And finally, it accelerates the turnover of minerals in bone. So bone reformation, bone turnover is enhanced. Now, if you take that thyroid from the other side, we can see a couple of things. Here's the position we're looking at. Now we've removed the trachea and the esophagus and the spine, which would block our view, and we're just looking at the back posterior surface. And we see that C shape. See how it's open at the back? And all of these lighter colored lobes that are sort of pinkish, where the indicated by where the pointer is right now, are the lobes of the thyroid gland. But lo and behold, we look through a microscope. Look at this up here. Here are the typical follicles and C cells of the thyroid on both sides of this very different spot of tissue. Look how different it looks in appearance. Blow it up, and it's got these very dark staining nuclei in these closely packed cells. These are the parathyroid or chief cells. You can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4 clusters like this. Together, those 4 regions constitute the parathyroid gland and produce a different group of hormones. Now, the primary effect is on calcium level, and I want to return to calcium because of its importance. Most of it's in the bone. But look at this level, 8.5 to 11 milligrams. First of all, per deciliter. First of all, that's a low level. But secondly, look at the range that it tolerates, 8.5 to 11. That's only 2.5 milligrams per deciliter of range. It rises a little bit, the body works to bring it down. And if it falls a little bit, the body works to bring it up. So what happens if you approach 11? Calcium levels are rising. The thyroid gland produces calcitonin. Now, calcitonin effect is interesting. When the level is high or approaching high, it simply lets the calcium that has been filtered out to make urine. Instead of reclaiming it, it lets it go. It lets it go out in the urine. It also stimulates the osteoblasts to actively make bone. That means it's pulling calcium out of the plasma. Both of these effects drop the levels down into the homeostasis range. So this first upper, to bring the calcium level down, calcitonin from the thyroid is the active hormone. When the calcium levels start to drop dangerously, falling levels, the parathyroid secretes parathyroid hormone. Its effects are just the opposite. In the kidneys, calcium is resorbed, so it is conserved, it is retained. It's not lost in the urine. We stimulate the osteoclasts while leaving the osteoblasts alone, and so more calcium, more bone is torn out. Bone remodeling demands this. So we can basically chew up that solid hydroxyapatite and release the calcium to increase the level from a source that's not dietary. This parathyroid hormone also stimulates the release of calcitriol in the body, and that calcitriol has an effect on the digestive system. Without calcitriol, calcium in your food is going right by you, by the endothelium of the small intestines and out in the feces. Increased calcitriol means you're absorbing more. These three effects will bump that calcium level back up. So you see a balance between thyroid and calcitonin, parathyroid and parathyroid hormone. We see here a table that summarizes these effects. Again, regulatory control. The thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and the C cells are actually stimulated directly by the calcium levels that are in the circulating blood plasma. Down here, the parathyroid are in the same way stimulated by calcium level and also by calcitriol, that is the opposite hormonal effect to calcitonin. So what I'd like to do right now, we're ready to transition to the adrenal gland, but we've been going a while and I want to take a break. So I'm going to end this recording. This is the end of 18A, first part of the endocrine system.